the Famicom, MSX2, NES, Wonderswan Color, PS1, GBA, 2000s mobile phones, PSP, smartphones, the 3DS, and Steam. These are all home to the game that started it all, the original Final Fantasy. We're familiar with the Final Fantasy brand and series today, and we're going to see a trend among these ports of Final Fantasy I, where their goal is to bring it more in line with the rest of the Final Fantasy series. Because of this, we have a handful of visual styles to look at, as well as gameplay revamps, and just as important, bug fixes. Given the non-romanticized circumstances of its development, the first Final Fantasy is full of bugs that heavily affect balance and viability of classes, spells, and party compositions. Thankfully, a lot of research has been done on Final Fantasy I and its various ports, so it's thanks to the Final Fantasy community for this video going into as much detail as it does. To get started with the ports, we'll be looking at the MSX2 version of Final Fantasy. And we're starting here instead of the NES version because Final Fantasy came out on the MSX2 in Japan before the NES in America, so it predates the changes seen in that version. This version builds off of the Famicom original, and to explain some of the changes, we'll have to dive into how some of the game's mechanics work. First off, the overworld's layout was subtly changed, but the sections where monsters are intended to spawn were not adjusted to match, so some encounters are found in different locations than they were intended. In Final Fantasy I, the Black Belt is a unique class with unique formulas for calculating attack and defense. For example, they are programmed to hit twice as many times when unarmed, and their defense is supposed to be equal to their level when unarmored. In the MSX2 version, however, it seems that the Black Belt does not have their unique formulas, so their attack and defense function like any other class now. Though there was also a bug in the NES version, where instead of checking for armor, for whether they should have their defense equal their level, it actually checked for a weapon instead. That's not an issue for the MSX version since it doesn't give the Black Belt a unique calculation for their defense anyway, but regardless, the Black Belt's attack and defense function properly in every version after the NES version. Additionally, there was a woman in Cornelia Castle who had dialogue but wasn't visible in the NES version, but she's made visible in the MSX2 version, though in future ports she's been removed entirely. Thanks to being on floppy disk, there was more storage space, but there was significantly longer load times. There's no batteries in these things, of course, so you'll need blank floppies for saving. The MSX has a technical advantage to the Famicom in both terms of visuals and audio, but it is subjective whether you prefer the graphics of the MSX version over the Famicom original. And then the music was updated thanks to the different hardware, and some dungeons had their tracks swapped. Next, we'll talk about the NES version of Final Fantasy. Nintendo of America's notorious censorship policies from the era affected Final Fantasy I. Most of the visual changes they made have since carried over to every port as well. Crosses were removed, churches are now clinics, the last floor of the game was changed from a hexagram to a triangle, and Medusa enemies were given tops. Additionally, since spell names could only be 4 characters long, many spells were changed to accommodate. This is how we get spell names like Lock, Lit, and Bane. There was a handful of character sprite updates, menus were given icons, and the beholder enemies were renamed to Eye enemies, and their sprites have been changed to differentiate them from beholders from Dungeons & Dragons. Now, there are 2 Famicom versions, the original release and then a later re-release that included Final Fantasy II as well, and the updated Medusa, Eye, and character sprites were brought into the second Famicom release. However, the Beholder enemies were still named Beholder. And then later on, when the Famicom version came to the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS eShops, not only were flashing effects toned down, but Medusa's sprite was also reverted back to being topless, while the Beholder's name was updated. Now, we have to level on this. The original version of Final Fantasy straight up has non-functioning spells, abilities, weapons, stats, and items. If you're looking for a more polished version of the original, you're gonna have to look into ROM hacks of it. The MSX2 version, regardless of visuals or its soundtrack, still has a hefty number of bugs and oddities, as well as some serious load times that require patience. So then for those looking for a more accessible experience or more modern visuals and music, should probably consider one of the other versions we look at. Next is the Wonderswan Color version. If you've played any version of Final Fantasy I past the original version, or if you played other 2D Final Fantasy games, then things are going to start looking familiar. To start, in Final Fantasy I, if you target an enemy who's died before the attack can happen, your attack will be ineffective, rather than automatically targeting another enemy like you might be used to in other games. The Wonderswan Color version gives you an option to automatically redirect your attack, which combined with the other changes results in significantly faster encounters. Previously, a simple encounter with a few goblins could easily take around a minute or more, but now that same encounter could take seconds. This is also thanks to the UI that's been revamped to resemble the menus from the Final Fantasy SNES titles, enabling a lot of quality of life upgrades, like being able to see how new equipment compares to what you have already, optimizing equipment, buying items in bulk, viewing the overworld map, and in battle you can see which status ailments anyone has. Additionally, you can dash in towns or dungeons, delete spells from your limited spell slots, have 8 save slots, a quick save slot that lasts until the console is turned off, equipment is now pooled among the party rather than every character having individual equipment inventory, more curatives can be used in battles now such as softs, and silence no longer prevents the use of items. The trade-off for these changes is that the bosses were given more HP to balance the gameplay. The Wonderswan Color version also addresses many of the notable and well-documented bugs from the original release. A large handful of magic spells, items, and weapons all now function as they were intended to. Fleeing also works as it was originally intended to as well, though future versions rework fleeing entirely. Some important bugs were left in for now, which makes them seem like they were intentional, such as how crits work and the Peninsula of Power. We'll touch on those bugs much later. The Wonderswan Color version has a larger color palette compared to the Famicom. Thanks to the more capable hardware, the game performs faster, sprites were updated to be more consistent with the Super Nintendo Final Fantasy games, buildings now have interiors, the game's script was vastly expanded since now the hardware can handle more than one text box per conversation, many cutscenes were incorporated including an opening, and battles have full backgrounds now. And additionally, the eye enemies use their revised sprites as well as their revised names. On top of a different sound to the original soundtrack, more new original music was composed as well, including boss battle music. The PlayStation 1 version of Final Fantasy builds off of the Wonderswan Color remake. This version is part of a compilation known as Final Fantasy Origins. Final Fantasy 1 and 2 both released individually in Japan prior to this collection, but the collection served as the first time the US got these versions, and the first time Europe got Final Fantasy 1 at all. This is the version you'll find today on the PS3 and Vita PSN US and Japanese stores. For the first time, the Japanese text was updated to include kanji. Meanwhile, the English localization has been redone, featuring the expanded text from the Wonderswan Color version, localized for the first time, as well as a more faithful translation. There's also a raised limit of characters and spell names from 4 to 6, Fighter is now named Warrior, and Black Belt is now Monk. An easy mode has been incorporated. This easy mode reduces the prices in shops, enables you to level up faster, and increases the chance of stat growth upon leveling up. Stat growth in the first Final Fantasy would depend on your class. Each class has guaranteed stat increases for each level from 2 to 50, or 2 to 99 now since the level cap was raised in the PS1 version. For non-guaranteed stats, the game uses RNG and calculates whether or not those stats will increase upon leveling up, and this calculation is what's been buffed when playing on easy mode. Due to the new hardware, the game features an FMV opening, a bestiary, art gallery, item collection, and an updated soundtrack. This is also, so far, the highest resolution graphics the game has had yet. We'll notice from now each version builds off another version's sprites, but makes changes to accommodate the different hardware and screen sizes. So the PS1 version is able to zoom out a bit and show more of any given area. Meanwhile, we'll notice the Wonderswan Color and our next version are significantly brighter since they released on handhelds that didn't have backlights. And now for the Game Boy Advance. Final Fantasy was part of a compilation known as Final Fantasy Dawn of Souls, which also included 2. The artwork gallery and item collections were removed, though the bestiary and Wonderswan Color opening remain. You can unlock a soundtrack upon beating both games as well, and auto names were added to the start. Now, the European version features multiple language options, and while the US version's localization saw even further polishing and changes from the PS1 version, there were some changes to its localization in Europe, and sometimes a thinner font is used to accommodate languages with longer text strings. The most well-known inclusion to Dawn of Souls is the inclusion of 4 difficult optional dungeons, featuring bosses from other Final Fantasy games as well as new equipment and enemies in them. Dawn of Souls removes difficulty options, but mechanically is closer to the PS1 version's easy mode. Automatically retargeting attacks is now law of the land, and the option to enable a dash is replaced with the option to always be dashing now. More conventional series items such as high potions and Phoenix Downs were added for the first time, as well as permanent stat boosting items. Battles now have item drops, curatives and other items were reduced in price, you start the game with equipment and 500 gold as opposed to 400, and a reference to Erdrick was changed to reference Link. You also don't need to sleep at an inn or use a tent to save anymore. You only have 3 save slots, but you can now save anywhere in the game, including even in dungeons. The spell charge system that Magic used up until now was replaced with a more conventional MP system. The game has several tiers of magic spells, and previously you could only cast spells within a certain tier so many times before you had to sleep to recharge that tier. Now the conventional MP system turns the charges into an MP cost. The differences between these two magic systems is full of a lot of nuance as they have different strategies between early, mid, and end game. Generally, the conventional MP system lets you use magic less conservatively, while the spell charge system involves more careful consideration for your magic use for most of the game, especially when spell charges have a limit of 9 casts per tier, while MP can be as high as 999. Balance-wise, Dawn of Souls made a massive number of changes, such as tweaking the class's stat growth and changing how defense was calculated. Arguably, Thief benefited the most from the stat growth tweaking, as it generally lagged behind Warrior and Monk. Defense is now calculated for each armor slot independently, which enables the Monk to still receive some benefits from not equipping armor in some slots, while taking advantage of armor in other slots. Additionally, they addressed more long-standing bugs regarding stats. For example, monks who upgraded into Masters, had greater magic defense stat growth than Masters do. The result was that the upgraded class was more vulnerable to magic than intended as they leveled up, and the lower level you were when you upgraded classes, the more gimped your magic defense stat would be later. This is a bug. The class upgrades aren't supposed to have trade-offs like that, but it's been fixed finally. Meanwhile, up until this point, the intelligence stat was bugged and had no effect on how potent magic spells were, regardless of your class or even your level. This was finally fixed in Dawn of Souls, so Red Mage ends up nerfed, since the intelligence stat was the most important thing that was supposed to keep it from doing as much damage or healing as the White Mage or Black Mage. And to compensate for the changes that are in the player's favor, enemies now have even more HP across the board. While lower resolution than the PlayStation version, the GBA version still uses the same set of sprites and still makes some advances over the Wonderswan Color's visuals, as well as adopts a new version of the soundtrack. And with all these changes in Dawn of Souls, Final Fantasy I is now more in line with the later Final Fantasy titles than ever. If you were looking for something more faithful to the original game's gameplay, but utilizing these visuals, you'd be looking at the PSX version. But if you're down for a less tedious magic system and more familiarities with other Final Fantasy titles, as well as a lot more polish, the GBA version's there. However, there's still more versions that make further advances from these versions both mechanically and visually. But for now, let's rewind that a bit for the Namco mobile version of Final Fantasy. This is a hybrid between the Wonderswan Color version and the original version. None of the PS1 or GBA features are present here. The script for this version has once again been retranslated. Meanwhile, the Secret 15 puzzle minigame was removed, but the inventory limit has been raised, some enemy groups and locations have been moved around, Knights and Ninjas, which are upgraded classes for the Warriors and Thieves, can now have up to 9 spell charges by the end, and Chaos's HP in the end has been doubled. There's no boss music outside of the final boss in this version, and the MIDI music doesn't loop seamlessly. Now there are multiple versions of this specific port depending on the device you use. Larger, more powerful phones could play the game with touchscreen controls and possibly sound effects. Not at the same time as music though, and for some reason this version doesn't seem to have cursor memory options. The most basic version, meanwhile, had no sound effects and was designed around very small screens. While the sprites themselves remain updated, layouts and details are simplified similar to that of the original Famicom version, giving us a really interesting version that had to make a lot of compromises as opposed to building off more and more powerful hardware. Anyway, next up is the PSP version, which builds off of the GBA version, but uses the PS1 version's FMVs, soundtrack, and its art gallery. This is the version you'll find on the European as well as Japanese Vita PSN stores, but not on the USN PSN store, despite releasing in the US. The bosses in the GBA bonus dungeons that came from the other Final Fantasy games now have their own respective game's music. The defend command was also added to battles and you can skip cutscenes. This version has a unique equipment bug that enables the player to do things like equip gear that they're not supposed to, or to go even further, duplicate gear. Another new bonus dungeon was added to this version as well, known as the Labyrinth of Time, featuring a further challenge and new super boss. Visuals saw further upgrades. This is the most the visuals have been updated since the Wonderswan Color version. 3D is used subtly in the overworld, visual effects were updated, and sky effects have been added to towns and dungeons, so for example you can see shadows casted by clouds. And then we have the iOS, Android, and Windows Phone versions, which build further off of the PSP version. However, the Android version does not include the GBA or PSP bonus dungeons, though the iOS and Windows versions do. The window color options, oddly, and the art gallery were removed. Unfortunately, this version is incompatible with most modern smartphones, so it's not a surprise that this version has been delisted from storefronts when the Pixel Remasters came out. Even if it does run for you, this version's game speed is tied to its frame rate and needs to run at 30 FPS to run correctly. As always though, with mobile games your mileage may vary. On Windows phones, the game could retain your phone's status bar at the top and supported achievements. While the game's delisted now from the iOS and Android stores, it's still available on Windows phones with a trial if you're curious. This version suffers from some exclusive bugs. When you level up in Final Fantasy 1, not only are some of your stat gains random, but your HP and MP are supposed to increase by a random value as well. However, in this version, they can only increase by either the maximum total value or minimum value, depending on your level. Moreover, the minimum value will be picked 15 times more often than the max value, so essentially leveling in this version is horrendously bugged. The UI was entirely redesigned to be a touch-friendly interface. This is necessary since the game doesn't support controllers. Otherwise, we can tell this version resembles the PSP version visually. Now here's a modern version that many in the US may not be familiar with. This is the 3DS version of Final Fantasy 1. This version was included free with first print copies of Final Fantasy Explorers in Japan, and then it was later released on the eShop. This is a full-blown port of the PSP version, built around utilizing both screens. On the bottom screen you have your party info and a map and legend. Towns are now 3D models as well, which really helps sell the diorama or shadow box-like effect when you play in 3D. Aside from the equipment bug, the PSP version has the most content and is significantly more polished. While the smartphone and 3DS versions build off of it, they aren't as visually sharp, so the value of the 3DS version relies on utilizing that 3D. And of course, there's the issue of accessibility. There does seem to be recent interest in the 3DS homebrew scene to create a fan translation of this 3DS version, but otherwise it's only in Japanese right now. Meanwhile, like we said, you can't digitally purchase the PSP version legitimately right now in the US or the smartphone version anywhere besides on Windows phones, and which even then it has mixed compatibility. Now 9 versions later, we have arrived at the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. This version takes an interesting step in trying to maintain elements that made Final Fantasy I stand out from the rest of the Final Fantasy series. We'll see though that this principle is applied selectively and there are still more new features to this version. While the bestiary, music player, item collection tracking, and gallery return, the GBA and PSP bonus dungeons are no longer present. The Pixel Remaster goes back to the spell charge system of the original game. However, enemies and bosses retain their GBA version stats, though there's still some more changes under the hood. For example, the way enemies choose which actions to do in battle was totally changed. The US GBA localization is used with some additional polish, Wonderswan Color cutscenes remain, prices in shops are reduced as they were in the GBA version, and traditional items like high potions of Phoenix Downs are still in. You also can't save anywhere you want to anymore, but you can save in the overworld, so you aren't required to use a tent or go to an inn like you were in the original versions. You can also quick save wherever you want, and you can load that quick save even if you've closed the game or the device you're using. You can walk diagonally now, even when you're going through tight areas, change who in your party walks in the overworld instantly, fixed encounters are represented by monsters in a box or hooded dudes, enemies can now fail to flee, some locations had subtle quality of life changes like the pathways in the marsh cave, Maps and legends were incorporated to help you find your way and find where you are, and petrified party members now gain XP. And for the first time, the game now has an auto battle system that speeds up battles, which repeats the last action you used, with the option to be on by default when battles start. There's no option for always dashing anymore or for message speed, which is now always instant. The Peninsula of Power is a known spot where the encounter map of an area you're not supposed to be able to access early in the game includes a peninsula that's sticking out, thanks to the square shape of the encounter maps. This spot has been left in every version of Final Fantasy I except the Pixel Remaster. The critical hit bug, however, remains. This is a bug where your weapon's index number determined its critical hit chance rather than the number actually supposed to determine it. As a result, crits are less common than intended in the beginning of the game and significantly higher towards the end of the game. The puzzle minigame on the ship is still present, but it doesn't have any rewards anymore. Previously, you could use this game to farm gil. And now we'll discuss visuals. The sprite work for the main party has been entirely redone. The new sprites were recreated by the game's original designer, as well as the designer behind much of what defines the look of the 2D Final Fantasy games, Kazuko Shibuya. This shows as well as the sprites are based on their original appearances, and not the more Super Nintendo era-like sprites from the Wonderswan Color version and onwards. Thus, the idea here is to help the game retain its own look among the Final Fantasy games. By contrast though, NPC sprites resemble their Wonderswan Color designs more so than their original NES designs. New animations and effects are present as well for items and spells. Additionally, the Pixel Remaster offers a classic filter, which simulates the effect of a CRT. It does its job in that when we study dense pixel areas, they do blend together and create the illusion of depth, though the filter may come off as too strong at first, especially on larger displays. I personally love a good CRT filter, though this one does give me a bit of a headache, so I haven't been using it. The Pixel Remaster supports a ton of aspect ratio and resolutions, though I don't think this is technically considered arbitrary resolution support since you can't freely resize the window. And this font though we should talk about. Not everybody will have issues with this, but you can judge for yourself by looking at this footage. This font is just so narrow and small that it's frustrating for some people to read constantly. From a designer's perspective, I could only really think there is a technical or programming reason why the font is like this, similar to the thin font of the PAL version of Dawn of Souls, or maybe because of the various aspect ratios the game has to support. For now, those on PC, you can either use a mod or swap the Japanese font's English characters in, but these solutions shouldn't be necessary and they aren't perfect either, since this doesn't work for mobile users and won't work for the eventual console releases. But anyway, the soundtrack has been entirely reorchestrated, setting it apart from the other versions of the soundtrack. Additionally, sound effects were lifted from Final Fantasy IV's 3D remake, as well as Final Fantasy V and Final Fantasy VI's mobile ports. For those who are playing this version on mobile, there is still no controller support. However, an additional movement option was added where you can tap the tile you want to move to and it'll automatically move to it. While the UI for both versions is larger and has a bit of a more modern design to it, the mobile version's UI does actually differentiate from the PC versions. As such, the PC version is designed more traditionally with controllers in mind, while the mobile version is definitely more suited for touch controls. Additionally, the bestiary has this interactive map view, and the mobile version's bestiary supports augmented reality battles. Unfortunately though, there's zero tracking, which is what I thought augmented reality was, so basically it just overlays the battle over your camera. Lastly, I'd like to mention the performance of the PC version, as the Pixel remasters have been giving some people issues in regard to screen tearing since there is no in-game VSync options. The patch as of August 27, 2021 addressed this a bit, but the notes specify that the issues will continue to be worked on. If I can break character to complain about PC games again for a moment, I just set my Nvidia graphics settings to enable VSync by default universally, cause I'm getting sick of how many games recently are releasing on PC with screen tearing and no VSync options. Reception to the Pixel remasters has been pretty critical, since there are 9 other versions of this game you could possibly play with varying levels of accessibility in different ways and different flavors of visuals and gameplay. If you want to download a version on Steam and play, then bam, you're done. Otherwise, there's things to consider like the visuals or gameplay experience that interest you. For example, if we want to play with a more conventional MP system, you may be attracted to the GBA or PSP version's visual styles, or their more polished gameplay experiences and bonus content. But otherwise, if the selective elements of the original attract you to the Pixel remaster, then it's a great version as well. There's no wrong version of the first Final Fantasy, so long as you enjoy the experience. Thanks for watching, guys. If you're interested, I keep active on Twitter and have a Patreon if you'd like to help support these ongoing videos. Also, special thank you to Avin Chaos for helping to peer review this script before the video went up. For the next port comparison, we'll be looking at Final Fantasy II and its Pixel remaster, so please stay tuned and thank you again.